Number 9. The Rebels with Cheat Codes. The Woodland Alliance.
The Woodland Alliance are all about creating pressure through taxing their opponents. They force the other players to make difficult decisions the second a few clearings become sympathetic to their cause. Before any Woodland warriors even hit the board, they're causing all kinds of problems for the capitalists of the Woodland. This, to me, is their greatest design strength as a faction.
The Woodland Alliance does a great job of expressing their lore through gameplay. Entering clearings that are sympathetic to the Woodland's cause and destroying those sympathizers rewards the Alliance with more supporters, which I think is pretty clever. It's kind of a show don't tell through gameplay, and it creates this feeling that you're playing as a rebellious force that's using guerrilla warfare tactics to get ahead of the colonizers around them.
On the flip side though, playing against a Woodland Alliance feels like you're fighting someone who doesn't play by the rules. Feels like they're cheating. They kind of are cheating. Guerrilla war being the prime example of that. However, there are some less talked about mechanics on the Woodland Alliance that I feel push this feeling even further.
The Alliance's supporters are the only cards on any faction board that aren't public information. This makes it difficult to figure out where Woodland is going to revolt, or if they can revolt at all. This turns the board into a pressure cooker. No. I can't tell you the amount of times in the early game I've just absolutely tweaked, just like praying that the Woodland's two supporters don't match. The discomfort this causes the player fits right in with the Alliance's design philosophy. You either pay the tax to remove the threat, or run the risk of getting nuked. Your choice. Either way though, I think the small detail of making supporters private information is an unsung hero of the Alliance's design. Another small piece of bullshit Woodland has...
I'm using the term bullshit in a complimentary way here, okay? Don't get it twisted, alright? Sometimes the recipe calls for a sprinkle of bullshit. It balances out the flavor.
Another small piece of bullshit Woodland has is when and how they craft. Woodland is one of the factions in the game that gets to craft after they've placed their crafting pieces. While a bunch of factions get to do this, I find it most noticeable on the Alliance. Like, sure, lizards and moles can craft after they've built their buildings, but building those can be pretty risky and takes up actions. By comparison, Sympathy is way more expendable and is easier to get out onto the board. Plus, assuming that the Empire doesn't wipe out all of our rebels' sympathy between turns, we'll have crafting pieces to use from previous turns as well. In practice, this allows for some disgustingly bursty turns through crafting and sympathy in the late game.
Also, Guerrilla War is the best ability in the game.
Guerrilla War is completely broken, but like I said, a sprinkle of bullshit does balance out the flavor, and I do think Woodland needs it to function as a faction. I find it pretty hilarious that when looking at die roll probabilities for Root, that Woodland Alliance just has a completely different stat spread. You fundamentally have to change how you approach the game in order to deal with Woodland. More than any other faction, Woodland Alliance teaches players to think creatively in order to deal with the problems presented to them in Root. The prime example being their unique weakness of having a very low number of pieces. The best way to abuse this is to make sure you rule where the Woodland Alliance has bases, in order to make sure that they can't leave and spread more sympathy, even if it does make me feel pretty morally questionable. That's not the only solution though. Any cards or abilities that grant you extra hits become exponentially more useful when fighting Woodland. Lizard zapping becomes an even better option for both Woodland's warriors and buildings. False orders? Woodland players really hate to see that shit crafted. In the end, all the other factions have to come up with their own guerrilla warfare tactics to slow the Alliance down, an ironic solution to this rebellious issue.
I think a lot of players, and especially new players, find playing against the Woodland Alliance to be quite troublesome. But for me, they're one of my favorite factions to go up against.
Sympathy tokens present many interesting choices for just about every faction in the game. Sympathy is a taxing effect, and who better to tax than the rich? Corporate shills, like otters, moles, and cats, have to be really careful when playing around Sympathy. Moles losing cards is disastrous for their swaying, otters can lose valuable crafting points, and cats will hate you and kind of love you at the same time, since they love the extra points, but hate that they have to spend a third of their turn to essentially play Bop It. How each faction reacts to Sympathy being placed on them is pretty interesting to me, and is deeper than you'd think. I find playing against Woodland Alliance to be really satisfying because of this. You have to figure out how to keep them down, while simultaneously scoring enough points to end the game before their late game burst. Because they're coming up, and they're about to get this party started.
I just wish, playing as the Woodland Alliance was nearly as interesting.
In my professional, non-professional, in my IMO opinion, Woodland Alliance is the most face-rolly faction in the game. They have one main strategy, and if it works, they'll rubber band past all the other factions in one devastating turn. If it doesn't work, they'll be held down and starved for points the entire game. While Sympathy is fun for other players to have to deal with, at least I think it is, it's less exciting for the player actually placing it. The choice of where your first few Sympathy go is pretty interesting, since whoever you decide to start placing Sympathy on gets pretty screwed over in the early game. But even then, your starting Sympathy is random, so it's not even entirely up to you where your first few Sympathy can go. Also, yeah, this example is a bit cherry-picked. I wouldn't blame you for looking at this and being like,
What?
But I do think it illustrates what I dislike about spreading Sympathy pretty well. Even on turn 1, your choices as to where you can place your Sympathy feel pretty funneled and not completely in your control.
Like, most of the time I'm placing my starting Sympathy, I'm trying to get 3 Sympathy out, and I'm trying to be as annoying as possible, preferably placing my Sympathy on moles or around badgers, any faction that really needs cards.
And because your starting supporters are random, and I usually play with random clearings, there's usually only 1 or 2 combinations of clearings that fit this criteria, making this choice pretty quick and easy for me usually. I know there are players that would disagree with me on this. A fellow League player of mine named T. Judge has done a bunch of research on this faction and seems to find them pretty deep. But for me, Woodland has just never had the most brain-burny early game in Root.
But maybe I'm just a god gamer.
After the early game, since you have to place Sympathy adjacent to other Sympathy, and your supporters aren't really determined by you, your options are pretty clear-cut between spreading Sympathy into particular clearings or revolting. It gets even worse in the endgame. If you have enough Sympathy out to where you're scoring big numbers, there will literally only be so many clearings without Sympathy for you to place Sympathy in. So in that case, the decision is made for you. Here's how most Woodland games go for me. Turn 1. I spread 2 or 3 Sympathy, and then I dump my hand into my supporters pile unless I got some Zaza in there. Turn 2, I try to revolt assuming I'm still on the board. I train a commander if I have the matching card of the revolted clearing, and then I recruit 2. If I don't have the matching card, that shit goes into my supporters. Turn 3, I spam Sympathy and crafting from here on out and win the game. This is the winning angle, by the way. If you're in the losing angle, you don't do any of this. You just lose the game, slowly and painfully.
And while that is obviously a bit of an oversimplification, I will say that my main gripe with the faction is how one-dimensional they are. I tend to gravitate towards the factions with more utility that are able to adapt to the board around them, and overall just have more variance in their gameplay. Not you, dude, get out of here!
The Woodland Alliance is fun for me to play every once in a while, but I'd be lying if I said that they kept me coming back. Jumping from 15 to 30 points hits hard the first time you do it. I mean, the first time I hit that big burst on this faction, I was all like,
no one has ever done that! No one has ever done that!
but after a while, you kind of just end up sitting there being like,
Well, I do get 3 kajillion billion points next turn, so hopefully no one kills me, or hopefully they do. I mean, it really doesn't matter, because in the end, I'm still just gonna... Okay, it is my turn. I'm gonna be doing the following thing. Spreading sympathy. And then I'm gonna mobilize this shit, and I'm gonna move here, and I'm gonna spread some more sympathy, and... You know what? I gotta take a shit. And I guess I'll spread some sympathy. I think I'm gonna take this left turn here and spread some sympathy. Now I'm gonna climb this wall and spread some more sympathy.
this isn't to say that there are no choices to be made with this faction. What cards you choose to keep in your hand versus putting into your supporters pile, or using it for training, is an important decision that I think weighs pretty heavily on the outcome of the game, and is actually a pretty tough call to make. A choice like that requires a lot of game knowledge and feeling out the board you're currently playing. Choosing between revolting or spreading sympathy is also a crucial underspoken choice on this faction. You'd think that you'd always want to use your super nuke, but often picking up points is the better choice. How many officers you want to have per game is also really important, since you quite literally do not control getting them back. Once they're promoted to being in the military, they serve for life.
All this to say, I understand there are important decisions on this faction to make. I just personally find them kind of stale, since all of those decisions revolve around the same end goal every game, which is to burst 15 points of sympathy on the last turn and steal the win. Overall though, the Woodland Alliance creates a really interesting problem for the colonizers of the Woodland to solve. However, due to their lack of variance in gameplay, I don't come back to them super consistently. With all that being said, let's get on to number 8.